A lovely morning to you, and thank you for keeping it on UBC TV. I'm Robert Chirabo, and today I'm so excited because I'm hosting a king. We are having the king of the Basongora in our studios, and this is OMUKAMA NDAHURA II KASHAGAMA. Thank
you for inviting me.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm very delighted to have a king in our studios.
I'm also happy to be here.
Before we go ahead, I want to introduce to you the topic of the day, which is we're looking at the role of culture in the socio-economic transformation of our countries. And of course, the best, they couldn't be anybody better than having a whole king to discuss the issue of culture. How is the Basongora kingdom?
Right now, we're doing okay. We have gotten scholarships for our children, schools are being built, the water services have improved drastically over the last 3 years, and we're also getting a lot of visitors from abroad who want to invest in projects, and I think now we have projects that are actually unique, including one that's producing raw material for medication. So we're doing okay, I think.
When we talk about the Basongora kingdom, yes, of course, many people might not know much about the kingdom,
yes,
though they know the kingdom exists. But geographically, what part of this country are we talking about?
We're talking about the extreme western border surrounding Rwenzori Mountain, which we call Rwenzura in our language, Rwenzura Mountains. But Virunga National Park in the Congo, and also Queen Elizabeth Park, which covers it falls in about 6 districts, including Kasese district and Chegego, I think, Chenjojo, those areas. And then there used to be a small part that actually went all the way into northern Rwanda at one point, about 100 years ago, but Basongora, they are no longer self-identified mostly as Basongora. They think they are Rwandese, but yeah. So we're on both sides of the border of Congo and Uganda.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk about, we've had census and they have been looking at tribes of people, knowing how
yes,
many
yes,
people. What is the number of Basongora, just to estimate?
The UN and the last census say that in Basongora County, which is in Kasese, that there are about 25,000 Basongora. Our own estimates, we think is about double that. But there's also a lot of Basongora outside, especially in Shema, and also those who have moved outside of the areas that were traditionally for Basongora, in Masindi and in Buganda and in other parts in Toro and in Kole, especially in Abshozi. So there are many Basongora around. We think maybe upwards of 100,000. Yes.
Today we are looking at the role of culture in the socio-economic transformation of a country.
Yes.
Basongora culture is very rich.
Yes.
It has a lot of things, and I want to begin with the aspect of environment conservation.
Basongora is unique. I think that, especially now, we are very environmentally conscious traditionally. Basongora are forbidden by ancient law from hunting. We don't hunt animals. We don't eat meat traditionally. If we need to eat meat or protein, we take blood from a cow. You shoot the cow in the neck and then you draw the blood. The cow has to survive. If it dies, you cannot take the blood. So you can draw cow blood many times from the same cow without it being injured at all. It's a painless process. So we also don't destroy trees. We mostly consider trees to be sacred. So it's an environmentally conscious tradition. But I also want to note that before the colonial occupation, other groups in Uganda had mostly the same traditions, even those that hunted. I mean, there were taboos against hunting animals of your own clan totem. If you were fisher people and you were fishing, you could not take young fish out of a lake. You were not allowed to cut trees of a certain size. You know, if they were over already a foot, I think, something like that, those trees became sacred. So, unfortunately, I think the modern environment has sort of commodified everything. People think they can just cut all the trees and things like that. And so I think that Basongora are not that unique, except the fact that we still have a population of Basongora who are very grounded in the traditions, that now we have a surviving population of people who actually still follow those rules, whereas maybe other tribes have lost some of that tradition. Yes. So I think that being environmentally conscious is part of our traditions, yes. Yes.
Well, of course, today the world is gripping with the challenge of environment challenges such as global warming. Agriculture is becoming very expensive because now you must have fertilizers, you must irrigate. And as we're looking at the role of culture here in socio-economic development, Basongora have that rich culture, just like the OMUKAMA NDAHURA II KASHAGAMA, whom we're having in the studios, who is the king of the Busongora kingdom, as mentioned. When we talk about culture, OMUKAMA, where do we see in modern day culture being a great aspect in the area of development?
Well, the most important thing that we have as a resource, economically or socially or in any way, that binds us together is language and the values we share as people. If you don't have those commonalities, it's very hard to organize. And it doesn't matter if you're very intelligent people, you have resources in your country, if you cannot organize yourselves, you will remain poor and you'll be subject to other states that are more organized than you. So the biggest asset that any country has is their culture. It's bigger than the minerals they have, it's bigger than the armies they have, it's bigger than everything else they have. You have to have culture as the unifying bond that allows us to communicate. We're now speaking English because the British people came here and imposed their culture on us. But because we speak English, we serve them more than we serve our own communities. Because everything we're producing is in English a lot of the time. The novels we're writing, the plays we're doing, and the investments we're seeking. You know, when we go to look for partnerships, you look for English-speaking partnerships because it's easier to communicate with them. And because we've been working with them for a while, so you know how they behave and what their value system is. So you can understand that culture is an important asset. And it's important even for countries that are very advanced. I mean, if you go to Japan or to North America, Canada, you will find that every day, if you step out of your house, you're constantly exposed to their history. You know, the biggest buildings in North American cities are always museums and galleries and libraries. These are cultural institutions. And I think that Africa has lagged behind in terms of cultural development. We talk about economic development, and yet we keep losing our culture because we're disorganized in that manner. We're not investing enough in the culture. But if we do, we will find that it's easier for us to build other things, to have business relations that are functional. You cannot end corruption, for instance, because it's a product of culture. So you need to invest in culture so that you know, people have the same value system, you know. We know that if somebody steals something, then everybody should be offended. But if you're living in a society where that is not a norm, they don't mind. You know, they say, if somebody's stolen, it is good luck or something. So we need to go back to a point where we realize that culture is just as important as the economy, or better. It's just as important as having a defense system with an army. It's just as important as having schools or anything else.
How do you make that relevant to the current generation where so much of copying from the Western world, and we think it is now modern to behave in a certain way. It is modern to dress the way I'm dressed, in a suit and smart as this, and maybe someone who would say it might not be that very modern to dress in a cultural outfit. So how do we sell this to a generation?
I think the best way to do it is to have leaders who are proud of their culture and who are aware of its importance. You know, I remember one time I met one of the ministers who was responsible for culture, and I asked him, you know, can you have the members of parliament, the men, because the women usually dress culturally sometimes, could you have the men at least wear some traditional clothes sometimes when they're in parliament, instead of wearing suits all the time? And he said, yes, we can try that. And also remind people that we need to educate people. We need to go out there and say, you know, I'm a university-educated person. For instance, I spent most of my life abroad in Canada. I ran for parliament in Canada. I've done university lectures, and yet I think it's okay to dress like this. but it's education. And I remember when I came back to Busongora, when I returned in 2011, and I dressed like this in public, and I remember people complaining, saying, how can a person who's come from abroad dress traditionally? And I thought, how sad, if you go to other parts of the world, or any airport, you'll find Somalis dressed like Somalis, you'll find Hungarians dressed like Hungarians, Indians dressed in their traditions, even when they have got, they've been colonized by the British, but they still value their culture. So I think it's important for leaders in the country to show pride, and then people will follow. And also the opinion makers, the musicians that we have. Instead of only always wearing the fancy Western clothes, take time off and have an event where you can wear, traditional Baganda clothing, or traditional Batoro, or Banyoro, or traditional Langi clothing, or whatever. African stuff, yes.
When you look at the world today, it is so much interested in making money.
Yes.
What are some of the opportunities where we can see culture as a resource for making money?
Well, most directly, of course, the idea that we have that, for instance, our national parks, which are now the biggest income earner for Uganda, there's an assumption that their survival is accidental, or it's a product of the British. But the British found these animals here, and they found that we already had a cultural preservation system. Like among the Baganda, for instance, you cannot kill an animal that is your totem, OMUZIRO, right? That's what they call it. The same thing with Basongora, the same thing with every tribe. So these animals have survived because of us. And right now, of our culture. They survive because of our culture. And right now, they are earning income for Uganda. Uganda now, I think one park alone, Queen Elizabeth Park in Busongora, gets about 100,000 foreign visitors every year. And each one spends, several $1,000s in Uganda before they leave. Tourism, cultural tourism now, I think, is the biggest income earner for Uganda. We earn more from tourism than, I think, agriculture and several other industries combined. So anybody who has been having a poor, negative view of culture should, look at the statistics and the numbers and count, do some simple accounting and realize, in fact, that Uganda's currently biggest asset is the environment and culture, and those two things go together. Yes.
Well, our view, in case you've just joined, I have in studios, that is the king of the Basongora. That is OMUKAMA NDAHURA II KASHAGAMA, and we are looking at the role of culture that is in the socio-economic transformation of any country. When we talk about culture transforming communities, transforming a nation,
yes,
Uganda will have very, very diverse cultures. And of course, we have in those cultures, those kingdoms that are more or less getting extinct to some level. How can we, as a country, as leaders, rejuvenate these cultures that we have of late?
There has to be a change in the way we think and operate. And fortunately, many of our leaders understand this. I think that they're sort of frustrated because they think maybe the other priorities matter first. But Uganda today is on the record internationally for now being one of the most important destinations for environmental and cultural tourism. And so I think that we need to invest in more museums, more libraries, and I think Ugandans are conscious of that. I know this government, for instance, has now made the Heritage Commission a very important. You can now not do any public project without having an environmental impact assessment that involves heritage assessment. So it's the Heritage Commissioner can stop excavation of any project on an order to say don't do this, don't destroy cultural artifacts. So we just need to work harder at it. But I think sometimes we blame the leaders, also the media. I'm a career journalist also before I became cultural leader. But we need to encourage the media people to go out and promote this. We need to have more cultural festivals. I think that everybody needs to make an effort. Every single person in the country needs to make an effort. Because, the president cannot make you wear your traditional clothes. He can only ask you to do so, and you can say yes or no. So I think people should take the initiative, make sure we have cultural festivals all across the country. There's now something called JAMA, the JAMA Festival. But we need more. We need more festivals, and we need to have a film industry, for instance. That needs to be done desperately, quickly, because we're competing with Hollywood now. You watch movies that are based on what they call a modern culture, which is not really modern. It's acculturation, the loss of order in North America, and that's what they're transmitting all over the world, and that's what people are picking up as a desirable trait. So we need to have a film industry in Uganda that can produce these movies. I'll give you a major concern that we have. For instance, there is no film about the struggle for independence, or even of the governments that have been ruling Uganda. There's not a single film, maybe one or two, that deal with what happened. We don't even have a museum for the NRM, for instance, or for any of the governments that's passed. We don't have a museum about any regime that has existed in Uganda. There's no museum for Idi Amin, or for, I've heard people mention that, or for Obote, or for even the current President Museveni. There's nowhere you can read. Jubis
has the unseen archives. Yes. We had that at the museum, but for a specific group, that is not what, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, the things, the resources are here, and all the information is here, except we need to reorganize it so that it's accessible very quickly to the public. I mean, there's a Uganda archives, we have a Uganda museum. But we need to invest in these things so that they become very prominent, and we need to promote them constantly, every day, as part of the efforts of everybody who thinks it's important to do this. And we cannot just leave it to the leaders, Everyone who feels that they need to do this needs to go out and make a contribution in effort. If you don't have the money, make an effort, make an effort to dress properly in a traditional way. Make an effort to learn your language, whatever it is. Learn about neighboring cultures, because they're all related,
But how do we get to this if many of the people currently are, I don't know your assessment, but I see interest in one's culture. Some people even do not want to identify themselves with who they are in terms of culture. They would look for maybe other kingdoms, other tribes, but they are very own. They do not want to be part of the cultural practices that some of their cultures do. So how are we going to move towards this direction?
Well, I think this is a big problem for Africans, all Africans everywhere. There is a lot of ethnic shame that has happened because of the colonial occupation, which ended about 70 years ago in most of Africa. We spent many years and generations being told that Africans were inferior, African culture is useless,
demonic,
that there was nothing of importance to remember, and we know that's not true. So, but many, regardless of the fact that it was a lie, many people have come to internalize that and believe it. And so they despise their own cultures, and they also despise themselves and want to be identified as other people. And so there's a big need, there's a need for a push in terms of resolving that psychological problem. And I think that everybody has a role to play, but I really don't know what the answer is. In terms of Basongora themselves, what we have done is we've gone to meetings where we explained to Basongora why Basongora was important at the time it was destroyed, and what the culture is, and to see people who are the most educated in our community, join the kingdom, has brought many others who are afraid, So now we have many people who are dressed properly. We've had international visitors come and pay attention to our culture. So because of that, people are saying, oh, if Wazungu and Chinese people can come to visit the king and enjoy, traditional milk in a traditional pot, or engage in grazing or whatever, it must be okay. So I think the international community needs to do some work also to realize that, yes, there was a colonial period where things were bad, and, British people were used against us. So they need to be aware that they have a role to play in terms of saying, that was wrong, it's okay to be African. But also Africans need to come out and say to their people, it's all right to be an African without feeling shame. And what you're doing now, this program, being able to reach many people and tell them it's all right to be an African who is educated and aware of the world and engaged internationally, to also love their own culture and not to feel ashamed about it. But I also find, let me just say quickly, that a lot of what we refer to as African culture, even that one has been destroyed, because by the time the Europeans came here, they found we had been going through slavery for about 1,000 years. So what they found wasn't even African culture. They found depressed communities that were struggling to make sense of the international system that had now attacked them and yet was invisible in many ways. They couldn't understand where the slaves were being taken. And those who did not tell the people who were being grabbed and being taken. But I'll give you an example, like the building system that people designed during slavery was different from the system that we used before slavery. In some tribes they began scarifying. They'd cut people's faces to make them frightening so that they would not be sold. The slave trade did not want anybody who was scarified to be sold in the market. So they took many children instead of scarified adults. So scarification in Africa began as a response to slavery.
And now in many cultures they may think that is part of their culture.
They may think it's part of their culture. Removing of teeth. When cultures degraded, they didn't have a way to do inoculation, so they removed teeth. So if you got tetanus, for instance, they could feed you medication. So certain things were practical, real needs of society. And yes, things are no longer that way. We have injections now, and we have tablets and things like that, and we have other ways of delivering medicine to the system. So you don't need to take your teeth out. Or you don't need to do certain types of things like female genital mutilation or whatever. So we need to identify which parts of African culture are the lasting things, the values that we take for granted, for instance. Kindness, receiving your visitors, treating people kindly, the ceremonies we do around milk or tea when you're serving people, the architecture, to retrieve the architecture that was there prior to us reverting to using huts. What did we build before? I mean, Bigobya Mujanyi is one of the oldest cultural sites in Uganda. It's over 1,000 years old. And they used stone. They cut into the ground, the rock, to create these enclosures. Nobody was doing that recently. When the Europeans came, they found stone houses in Busongora and Bumporo. And when there was a colonial officer called Galt, when he was killed, they gave orders to destroy all those houses, and they made everybody go and put all those houses down. So there's no evidence now of stone houses anywhere. So what I'm saying to people is that we need to identify those parts of African culture that are actually the values that matter, and then preserve those. Make sure they're part of our lives. The dignity and respect we give to elders, that's part of our culture. The dress, that's protective of your dignity. The language is an important aspect of our culture. If it dies, it doesn't matter if you are scarifying or removing teeth or throwing spears or whatever. You won't even have the language to describe what you've been doing.
When you mention about there are culture signs, culture sites, the language, there are those that are visible, that can easily be passed on. But then you mentioned a very big challenge. There is what we think is the way our cultures were doing things. But we were doing this because of situations that are befalling our cultures. African culture, unlike the European world, we do not have documentation. You just talked about we don't even have movies. So how do we, in the effort of making culture a tool for development, how do we make sure we're at the right path? We are seeing so many of copycat tendencies. This generation, why do we get this?
Again, because of ethnic shame, the self-deprecation, where people feel that African culture is inferior, which is wrong. Of course, it's not inferior to any culture around the world. And people have to also realize that
maybe Omukama, if I put it to you, for example, people that are going to come 20 years from now, and these are Basongora, we don't have written documentation to tell them that actually, if you find maybe a person who has scars on their face, it wasn't part of the Basongora. This was to scare away the slave masters.
Slave masters, yes.
So,
yeah.
what are we going to do so that people have the right culture, not to just copy things and put them in our culture?
I think the test for how you determine what is the right culture and what is not is you always go for the golden edge. What defines a person's status or a community status is what they've done at their best. We celebrate the one who won the Olympics, like
Kiprotich. Chege.
Yes, you remember the world record they broke. You don't remember the times they have fallen down and failed. So we know them for the best time when they're on top. Even culture the same way. You have to look for those things about the culture when it was at its best. That's what defines the culture. Not the times when it has been oppressed or destroyed or set on fire or pushed or put in camps. You know, we don't describe Jewish culture as being in concentration camps in Germany. That's not Jewish culture. Right? No, it's even German culture. That's war. Jewish culture is the classical music, the text they have written. If you're talking about German culture, we're not talking about the time when they were destroyed by Hitler or whatever. We talk about German culture, the art pieces they produced. We talk about Italian culture based on the masterpieces in the Baroque art or whatever they did. We talk about Catholic religion or Catholic culture or religious culture, Christianity, based on the good points, not the negative stuff. The negative stuff is there always, but you identify what defines a person is his best conduct. When he's appearing his best. It's the wedding day. It's the birthday time. So we have to identify what is it in our African culture is best about us and was the best about us before the tragedy of slavery and colonial occupation. That is what we call African culture.
Let's look at some of the gaps or some of the opportunities that we've not exploited in the area of culture that if we did could transform our communities, could transform our countries.
The first thing is we've entered a world that is now what they call a service economy. The production that people are predicted, you know, people have to be workers and produce things in factories. They think you have to be working all the time. But all that work is now being done by robots. And the economy is no longer dependent on your salary. You can earn money now without having a salary, without having a job. Just by being part of a social system. You know, we receive pensions. We're now going to get to a point where we're receiving what they call guaranteed universal income. In Uganda, it's begun by targeting the older people, saying, you know, they can receive 25,000 every month or whatever. But it's going to increase to the rest of society where we have free money that's coming. So what are we going to do with this money? People are now increasing their curiosity. They want to travel, to experience life, to jump out of the aeroplane and skydive, to go hard cows with the Maasai. They want to come to Busongo and figure out, you know, what are you doing with this cow, you know. And so the thing is this, that I think it is inevitable. It's coming. We need to focus on producing a service industry to receive visitors as the main part of our economy. So every unique thing you have in your house, in your language, in your conduct, in your relationship with your family and your friends and your community, that is what is valuable now, and that's what's going to earn you an income. And when people realize this, they need to start preserving those things and promoting them. And that's the way they're going to make money. Yes. That's the future of the world. That's where it's headed. There's no two ways about it. But only those communities that are prepared to do cultural tourism are going to benefit. Yes. I always wonder about, like for instance in hotels here in Uganda. If you go to any hotel in Kampala, you will find that they have pictures of vases, flowers on their walls. But if you go to Kenya, in Nairobi, you will find Maasai pictures and pictures of Samburus and Pokot. And you will go to the markets and you buy Kenyan artifacts made by Kenyans. Same thing with Rwanda. A lot of the artifacts sold in Uganda are brought from these countries. We're even doing art now in Katwe, in Kampala, that copies Rwandan art and Kenyan art, but we don't have a distinct Ugandan art, and it's very unfortunate. And yet, Uganda has art that's very ancient. I mean, for instance, there's the artifact they found in Luzira, the dreadlock head, that's thousands of years old. Why aren't Ugandans producing that, making copies of it? Because it's interesting and it's unique. We have Bigobia Mujeni, we have Nakaima Hill, we have dense cultural sites that need to be preserved and promoted, and we're doing this actually, some of us. But we need more people to get involved in this process. Yes.
Do you think Ugandans have come to appreciate your school of thought?
That's why I'm here. I mean, that's why you know, the reason I got invited, and the reason I'm very happy to be here is because I think that UBC has a duty to do this. I know that other TV stations are finding a problem doing that because they're depending on earning income from advertising and certain things. So, and we only have one public broadcaster in Uganda, where, you know, whether you get advertisement or not, the government has a duty to protect the UBC. But you can take the effort to do that, whereas other stations may not. The other stations are going to do whatever program the sponsor said, and it may not be culture. You know, they're sponsoring dance competitions and very interesting but non-cultural things. You know, and a lot of movies they're showing are dramas, what they call docudramas, made very simply, but about love triangles and witchcraft and things like that, none of which are our culture. But we're not doing documentaries about Kabalega or Mwanga or the founders of Uganda or the ancient Baganda Chintu. How did he come to become king of Buganda? You know, these are interesting things that we need to do, but the only way they can be funded is by actually government and those people who have excess amount of time and money investing in these things. And you cannot expect somebody who's on a salary, who's struggling to work in an office, even if he has a camera, to put together the kind of resources that a TV station can put together. Even the cameras that are just here in this room, I mean, they could make the films, and the skills that the journalists here have. But those skills can only be preserved in an institution like this one. You understand? The moment you let them go, they're going to go back on the road and drive taxis and borders, you know. And then the thing will be lost.
Finally, OMUKAMA, as we've been looking at the role of culture and the social and economic transformation of the people and also of the country, what is your last message to Ugandans in the element of culture and also to your people?
Well, the most important thing, I think, is for the people to have a sense of confidence in the history and not to feel ashamed. If you're feeling ashamed of your culture, it means you don't know enough about it. Most likely, if you take time to try and recover the information, you'll find it's something to be proud of. So I think that I need to encourage people to go out and try and document. It's easy to document now compared to before. We have cameras, we have books, and people are educated and they can write. So I want to encourage people to do that. And for Basongora specifically, I'm just very thankful, first of all, that they had the confidence in me to allow me to serve as a cultural leader, a traditional leader for Basongora. And I want to promise that I will not fail them, and I'm going to try and promote Basongora and the culture as best as I can. But also, not just Basongora, I'm a Pan-Africanist also. I believe that Africans have a choice to make in the future to protect their culture. It's a choice. We have to make a conscious decision. It can't just come by accident. So that's what I want to ask people to do, to make a conscious effort to go and find their culture and to learn it, yes.
We're seeing so many of late in Uganda, so many cultural groups, cultural leaders coming up. There's a question that always comes to people's mind. Is this, how healthy is this? Because previously we had a few, 4 or 5 kingdoms that went on.
Yes.
And now we're having so many. Is this healthy? Is this a threat?
No, I think that, first of all, there are 65 cultural communities in Uganda. That is what they refer to as tribes in the past, tribes. They all have, under Article 246, the right to create a kingdom. And this should not be a threat. This is how they were before. And we know now that having a cultural traditional institution is one of the best ways to preserve their cultures and languages, and also a way to mobilize society to be organized. So if we don't have these cultural institutions working, the immediate effect will be an increase in criminality, corruption, political instability, people who are groundless. I mean, if you have children who are being born and raised and they don't have a sense of authority, they don't know that they have to respect an elder. If you go on the bus, you know, you're a dignified person and you go there and there's no seat and a young 16-year-old boy refuses to stand up for you, you stand on the bus. That's loss of culture, you understand? It's inconvenient for everybody. So I think Ugandans should benefit from making sure that these cultural institutions are working. Unfortunately, most of the time, these cultural institutions were given permission to set up, but there was no manual, there's no handbook the government has given us to go and say this is how a king should behave or a cultural institution is supposed to function like this. There is no oversight committee in parliament that is designed to question cultural leaders. You know, what have you done with the authority we gave you, or the money we gave you, or the fundraising which we allowed you to do legally? Have you used it for building schools or for buying machetes to cut your neighbors? You understand? So there has to be some oversight put in place. There has to be resolutions in parliament to try and manage these cultural institutions because it doesn't exist. I'll give you an example. Some cultural institutions went ahead and created militias as royal guards. It's wrong. It's illegal, in fact. But nobody followed up and said, don't do this. In fact, when ministers go to their events, they thank them because these people are marching around like soldiers. But it's illegal to march around as a soldier and salute if you're not a member of the UPDF or the Uganda Prisons of Police or the Uganda Scouts. The Uganda Scouts requires permission from the cabinet to do what they do. But cultural institutions need to be managed the same way that anything else is managed. You can't just create an institution and allow self-appointed people to simply do what they want without any kind of guidelines. We've asked the government to come and intervene and say, you know, could you take cultural leaders or their staff to a university and once and have a big orientation system once a year to teach them, you know, what's a cultural institution, how does this cultural institution work, what's the best example, you know, how does Buganda or Toro or Karamoja handle this particular problem, and how can one cultural institution benefit from another. So these lessons need to be created. These opportunities have to be there, and if they are not, our cultural institutions will continue to limp and struggle, and they will be taken over by people who are opportunistic and who are dangerous to the society, which has already started to happen. Busongola has been lucky in the sense that there are certain cultural institutions that are organized to handle this. We've been able to see that this is a problem, and we're trying to get the government to be encouraged to intervene in this particular aspect. And you asked also, why are there many? I mean, there were some known kingdoms. But you remember that kingdoms were abolished twice in Uganda. Most people are aware of the 66 and 67 abolition by the Obote government. They're not aware of the abolition by the colonial government in 1910, when most of the cultural institutions were actually destroyed. So many of the cultural institutions people are saying are new are actually not new. They are simply the ones that were abolished before 67, who are being like the Bakochi, who were destroyed in 1897, the Bahoro, you know, the Bachiga, the Madi. All these were destroyed around the time before the government of Uganda was created, before the Uganda government was given independence. So people don't remember that they were actually there before. I don't know that there's been any cultural institution that's been created that in fact did not exist in the past.
Sure?
Yes. Even the ones they're saying are new. What's happened is some of them, they have changed the name.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. Like in Sangora where we live with two other cultural institutions. There's the Banyabindi, and there's what they call Rwenzuru, but actually should be Bukonjo or Bukonzo, right? The Bukonzo, as far as I know, had a cultural institution that was destroyed. It was very young at the time that it was destroyed by Bunyoro Kingdom initially, not even by the colonial government. And then they struggled to revive, and then eventually got taken over by Rwenzuru, which was not a cultural institution, but it's sort of been hijacked. And this again, the failure to protect the cultural institution means that you leave them open to hijack by other forces, you know, that may not always be benign, or that don't have the order that cultural institutions are able to master. And so we have the Banyabindi, who are also a group that's sort of coalesced, but with specific values that are very clear to them. And they exist not as a cultural institution, but they didn't have a king initially in the past, but they were a distinct group, separate from
So it
Basangora.
is very healthy for us to have diversity,
It
to
is.
have as many cultural institutions as they were.
Yeah, as they were. But what's not healthy is allowing them to function without order. without rules, without management, without proper training, you know, you would not create an institution. Even you have to register a small company, right? Why? And the URA will go and look at how it's spending money.
Then why not a kingdom?
Why not a kingdom that is...
Well, OMUKAMA Ndahura II Kashagama,
yes.
That is the king of Busongora Kingdom. It's been a pleasure having you part of this show. That is Good Morning Uganda and most of the GMU segment. Really, we just want to wish all your subjects the best, and of course to the kingdom. And with that, we now come to the end of our GMU segment. I will be handing over to the sports department there, where we shall see Ruben Mpima Kasera take us through the updates in the world of sports. But before, as usual, we have the quote of the day. And from me, Robert Chirabo Nyonyitono, I just want to wish you a lovely day. God bless you, and keep it on UBC TV.
Thank you.